This video has 6 parts, so understanding NESA's criteria, choosing your form carefully, justifying all your choices, external assessments, so the major work and the reflection statement advice, things I regretted or wish I did, and finally how to get started, generating ideas and dealing with writer's block. Just quickly before I dive in, research is super duper important. I'll show you the amount of research that I did, but being authentic, research, that's one of the biggest things you're going to have to focus on. Here are notes I took from WordXPress Seminar, so have a look, they're really useful. Also, I'll show you the full document of what I wrote for my assessment tasks, so the lit review and the critique of the creative process. So stay tuned. So firstly, understand NESA's criteria. Though it's a creative or analytical piece, at the end of the day, it's still going to be assessed by NESA, so look through the criteria on the website. Look at previous examples of works which have been sorted for you by bands. So band E1 and E2 versus band E3 and E4. Every year, NESA also reports on what students did well and what they can improve on. I'll chuck the link and show you a screenshot example here. You can also look at anthologies of Young Writers Showcase, which is where NESA compiles the best works from each year. However, be careful to not accidentally plagiarize, and also this may cause you to be stuck with like ideas, which it did for me for a while, so I just stopped looking at these and just focused on generating ideas for my own piece. Here's the link for English Extension 2 major work advice, and also double check this, but I think the major work journal is not counted in assessments. However, you should still fill it out consistently because it may help in generating ideas for your major work. Also because it's good to keep track of where you are at, and you really don't need anything fancy. I just used the one I got from Officeworks for about like $3. Okay, so there's actually 3 internal assessments: the Viva voce, which is 30%, the literature review, which is 40%, and the critique of the creative process, which is 30%. Okay, so I'm going to be giving a lot of advice for the Viva voce. So it was my favorite assessment because it just involved an interview where I talked and answered questions about my major work with 2 teachers, which I was pretty passionate about, so I found it to be quite fun. To do well in this, I think you should have a reason why you're doing everything. So every single choice in your major work should serve a purpose. So that's the genre, the setting, characterization, and especially form, because you may be grilled on why you're creating this, for example, in a short story versus a poetry form. So have a solid understanding of your form and other forms too, as well as distinguishing features. Also try and convey your passion for your major work, but if you're already passionate about it, then it should show. Practice grilling each other in your Extension 2 classes, or ask your family and friends to ask you questions. Now here are some questions that I just made up and practiced back then, which I've divided into categories. So form, what's the intended form of your major work? What have you learnt about it? What are its distinguishing features? Why have you chosen this form, and how does this form support your concept? What research have you done into form, and name one resource. Next is concept. So what concept are you exploring in your major work? Why have you chosen this concept? How have you developed it? And what are your sources of inspiration during the development of your concept? Finally, how is your concept an extension of the knowledge, understanding, and skills that you've developed in English Advanced and Extension? I think they really like it when you connect your major work to English Advanced and Extension, so make sure you prepare something for this. Next is purpose. So what's the purpose of your major work? What are you aiming to achieve? For audience, what or who is your intended audience and why? And how have you catered to this audience? Regarding your inquiry question, explain your inquiry question and why you've chosen it. How does it connect to your concept? How does it relate to your themes? And how does it tie into your major work as a whole? For research and investigation, what research have you conducted and recorded in your journal? How has it influenced the development of your project? Which individual texts have had the most impact on your major work and why? And if you're doing historical fiction, how have you researched about historical figures in your story? Reflecting on the process of composition, what have you learned about the process of composition so far? And the key thing I think is justifying literary devices or stylistic choices. So questions like, tell me about your major work. How is your major work original? Why does your major work matter? And how does it have textual integrity? What are the stylistic choices you have chosen and why? For example, what point of view? What structure is your major work and why have you chosen this? For this, non-linear versus linear, fragmented, cyclical. Why have you chosen a certain genre? What do you know about this genre? How are you going to use this genre in your major work? So are you going to follow the conventions? Are you going to comment or critique it? Are you going to parody it? Or are you going to subvert it? Stuff like that. And why not choose another genre? If you're doing modernism, have a look at what it means and what it was a reaction to in society. Also look at modernist art and also modernist literature. So what is modernist fiction? Why did you decide to choose modernism or use modernistic characteristics? And have you engaged with any modernist works? And what was the impact on your major work? Don't quote me on this, but some characteristics of modernism are non-linear narratives, as well as stream of consciousness and absurdism. And modernist authors that you can look at would include Catherine Mansfield, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, D.H. Lawrence. Similarly, if you do postmodernism, what is postmodernist fiction? What are the characteristics? Why have you decided to use these characteristics? Have you engaged with any postmodernist work? And I think metafiction is pretty prevalent in postmodernist work. So, really research that and read texts and analyses. So they might ask you questions like, what is metafiction? What are the characteristics? Why have you decided to use these in your major work? And what is the intended effect? Okay, so now is the literature review, which I think is 40%. This was my least favorite assessment because analyzing works is not really my strength. But basically talk about how your investigation of text has developed your understanding of your major work's forms and how it's influenced your stylistic choices. So for example, I analysed Metafiction by Mark Curry, Lost in the Funhouse by John Barth, The Art of the Short Story by Dana and R.S. Gwynne. So engaging with these texts influenced me to use things in my major work like intrusive author, intertextuality, self-reflexivity, collage structure by Pastiche, where I inserted or mimicked photographs, newspaper, screenplay conventions, and official Soviet notices. Okay, so the final internal assessment is the critique of the creative process, which is 30%. It's actually super useful because it's basically a draft for your reflection statement. So make sure you go full speed and put a lot of thought and effort into it, because then you'll get really useful feedback from your school markers. So in this, you basically talk about what choices you've chosen in your major work, as well as those that you've discarded or revised. And when talking about this, include why you chose to keep it or not keep it, and how this improved or impacted your major work. Also talk about your development as a writer, an author, or like a poet or a filmer. What insight has been born during the process of creating your major work, and why is it significant, and how has it influenced your major work? Okay, so the second part is choose your form carefully. Understand the form's most basic structure, the rules, how it's evolved over time, and why. Sometimes it's to reflect like upheaval in society and stuff like that, and talk about whether the rules have been broken and why. I can only comment on the short story because I did this form, but I think the basic structure for this is exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and then resolution or denouement, which can be open or closed. Also understand the difference between a short story versus a novel, novella, and flash fiction. I think short stories often explore one moment in time and is focused on the present moment, or as Nadine Gordama describes it, as a discrete moment of truth. Next is understanding like the pillars of the short story, so that's like characterization. So who's your character? What are their traits and why? What motivates their actions or choices? And settings, so what year or eras, and also where, like location. Conflicts, so is it internal or external? Plot, also themes, so what message are you trying to convey? Some themes include love, death, war, power, appearance versus reality, time, truth, conformity, class, identity, loss of innocence, grief. Also familiarize yourself further by engaging with several texts of your chosen form and analyses of them, especially the well-known ones. So for short story, I actually compiled a folder of short stories, and I read some by James Joyce, Raymond Carver, Alice Munro, Ernest Hemingway, Catherine Mansfield, and Kurt Vonnegut. I also noted down any techniques, words, phrases, or sentences that resonated with me, which I later drew on for inspiration when I was writing my major work. I asked my friend Sophie for advice. She also finessed a E4. She did short film and she did really well. For external marks, she got 48 out of 50. So for the Viva voce, she said, make sure you have a strong grasp on the storyline of your film to prepare yourself for your Viva voce. It would be ideal to have a screenplay already written. Also have a strong grasp on what decisions you will be making about the technical elements of your film. So the sets, the mise-en-scene, the camera techniques, as well as editing. For filming, she said to film early. If you procrastinate, it will not be a good time, basically. She had two classmates. They ran out of time, so they had to write a screenplay instead. Editing, it takes a lot of work, so you need to leave yourself a lot of time to go through different drafts and edits. After you have a first draft, you show a lot of people your film, or your friends and your teachers, and make sure you get feedback from like fresh eyes. Her film went through 8 rounds of drafts and feedback before submission, so that's something to keep in mind. Regarding the reflection, just start it early. If it's not assessed at your school, here are some rough guidelines that she's given you. You need to be drafting it at least around the second assessment, so that's your literature review, and you should have it fully finished by the third assessment, which is the critique of the creative process. The reflection is 10 free marks, so don't throw it away. For references, so for short film, at least half your reflection references should relate to short film specifically. A mistake that some students make is citing a lot of classic feature-length films, which shows that you don't have a good grasp on the difference between the two forms. That was her advice for short film. If you have any questions, feel free to chuck them in the comments and I will ask her to reply. Moving on to the next part. Okay, so thirdly, something that's super important is to justify all of your choices. Basically you've got to link everything back to purpose and effect. Always ask, how did the formal choices I'm making work to express my concept? Now here are some choices for you to think about. So first versus second versus third person point of view. The narrator, so are they unreliable? Are they intrusive? Reliable? Looking at the tone, looking at the styles, truncated sentences, or like stream of consciousness. Diction, so which is like using word choice. Certain words can kind of like evoke really harsh sounds, or like certain imagery, pacing, fast, slow, and when is the pacing fast, when is the pacing slow? Is it to reflect certain changes in the environment of the character? Setting, are you going to be using satire, irony, or parody to form a certain message? Conflict, again, internal or external. How does the character react to this conflict? What is the reason for their reaction? Also have a good think about genre: horror, comedy, romance, dystopia, fantasy, mystery, action, and historical fiction. Make sure to thoroughly research your genre, the basics, the elements, famous examples. Engage with these and look at analyses too. And also remember, like with form, you can subvert, critique, and comment on the conventions of genre. Now, I know I've just kind of like thrown a lot of words at you. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to give an example of choices I made, justifying them, just so you can see where I'm coming from. So I chose historiographic metafiction. It's a term that's coined by Linda Hutcheon, who is a literary theorist. So according to Wikipedia and Google, it basically shows the impossibility of objectively and transparently representing the past, whilst also signifying the importance of history. So in this, history is treated and rendered as a subjective account which includes deliberate, ironical, and playful changes in historical accounts and incidences. So there's often frequent allusions to other artistic, historical, and literary texts in order to show the extent to which literature and historiography are dependent on the history of discourse. So it uses intertextuality, which is basically implicit or explicit reference of other texts within a text. So for example, a major work, I referenced 3 texts: Alice Laplante's The Making of a Story, Solomon Volkov's Testimony, The Memoirs of Dmitri Shostakovich, and Elizabeth Wilson's Shostakovich, A Life Remembered. So in my major work, I kind of used metafictive characteristics. So like I said before, metafiction is when the author self-consciously alludes to the artificiality or literariness of a work by parodying or departing from novelistic conventions and traditional narrative techniques. Note that this isn't considered a genre but is a literary device according to some people. So in my major work, I did this by explicitly writing, what I write in the following space will be purely fictional. So this basically kind of tells the reader that, hey, this is fiction, it's not real. So you're basically breaking the fourth wall. And also kind of like regarding genre, I could have chosen creative non-fiction, but I didn't choose to because that uses dramatization, but it doesn't fictionalize. So I felt it allowed for less creative liberties than metafiction, where I'm able to bend the truth and reality a bit more. So examples of historiographic metafiction include The French Lieutenant's Woman, so have a read of that if you're interested in what it's like. Okay, and for character, I chose to write about Dmitri Shostakovich because I found his real life story to be quite fascinating and tragic. There was a lot of conflicting opinions and a lack of clarity on who he was as a composer and who he stood as a person, as well as events surrounding him. So it gave me again more creative freedom. Also, if you're doing historical fiction or historiographic metafiction, I would definitely recommend choosing interesting figures in history where similarly there's been a lack of clarity or disagreements regarding their personal life, their work, so like art or music, and all their lives, because again it'll give you more flexibility to work with in terms of creative freedom. I also did use satire and irony, but I forgot the reason why. And I also tried having some literary allusions, but I'm not too sure how effective this was. So I did try to allude to 1984, which I studied in English Advanced, by talking about like sour cabbage soup, so trying to allude to like the really dull food there, and also talking about how people were like pushed out of the depths of memory, so kind of referencing 1984 to how history is, subjective, it can be rewritten. The memory of who you are as a person or who you were in the past can be easily forgotten and erased. Okay, so part 4, external assessments, your major work and your reflection statement. So it's very nerve-wracking because you're judged purely on your major work and your reflection statement. So some advice for when you're working on your major work. I sometimes found it hard to delete and cut down when I was editing because I was attached to what I wrote. So what I did was I made another copy and kept the original. For example, the original would be like major work D2, but the edits would be major work D2.1, D2.2, and so forth. At the beginning stages, I found that printing out and physically highlighting and writing comments made editing a lot easier and more fun for me, but it also did waste paper, so I stopped doing it after 2 drafts. Something that I found worked for me was looking at NESA's criteria before and during my editing process, because it gave me a bigger picture understanding of what they were looking for. Something I think was super helpful was towards the later stages where I was trying to cut down on word count and kind of tighten up my short story. I made a document where I broke down all scenes in my major work chronologically, and I kind of divided it into tables as the idea, purpose, effectiveness, and actions to implement in my next draft. So I'll put a screenshot. I highly recommend this process, and I think it improved my major work a lot. Now, after rereading my major work and reflection statement after 2 years, I'm pretty confident that my reflection statement helped me get a decent mark because I explained a lot of the stylistic choices I made as much as possible. Definitely do not neglect it. So for this, please remember to write about your intended purpose, audience, major work, intention and the effect on the audience. Explain the relationships of concept, structure, technical and language features and conventions by giving quotes and examples from your major work, which I did a lot. Like I said before, make sure you link to English Advanced and the English Extension course from year 11 and or the year 12 course, and especially by like showing the impact that it has on your major work, again through a quote or like imagery. Explain the development of concepts during the composition process. So basically talk about, how did you find this concept? Were you planning on doing a different theme and then you moved to this theme? If so, why? How did this happen? What inspired you? And how did it make your major work better? Finally, explain the links between extensive independent investigation and the development of the finished product. So basically, how has your research and engagement with other texts influenced your major work, especially in terms of your stylistic choices? Okay, here's just a quick major work checklist for you to look at later on. So note that you have to attach a cover sheet at the very beginning of the document you're submitting. Attach a screenshot on what it says, but basically in this, you're going to be putting down your student number, your word count, the title, like what medium, and yeah, so for your major work, if it's like print medium, check the word count, make sure your student number is in the header, make sure the page number is in the footer, and this is super important. Ensure that your formatting is consistent unless it's like a stylistic choice and you've done it on purpose to reflect something, for example upheaval or whatever. Double check, all your page margins, font, spacing, size, indents, headings and subheadings. Also double check dialogue. So now, things that I wish I did and kind of regret. Definitely wish I learned about form earlier and like properly. Like I wish that was the very first thing I did even before starting English Extension 2. I think it's so important to have a solid understanding of what your form is like, the conventions, because knowing the basics and the elements that contribute your form will allow you to play with it, experiment with it and have a reason for doing so. For example, to represent chaos or upheaval in society and stuff like that. I also wish that I started writing and editing a lot earlier, and I definitely wish that I wrote more drafts. More specifically, I wish that from the very beginning I kind of did the table thing that I showed you before. So I wish that I outlined every scene, in terms of plot, techniques to use and purpose in driving the story, and also that I had different drafts for the scenes using different techniques, basically playing around with using different point of view, perspective, tense, tone, pacing, diction, style, all that type of stuff. I wish that I had clear pillars. I think this was a big weakness which kind of lowered my mark. The conflict was okay, but I wish I'd have explored more the character motivations. I wish I gave the characters more dimension by justifying their actions and kind of made them feel and seem more human, so that the markers and readers could kind of empathize and understand where they were coming from. Yeah, I think the lack of characterization definitely was due to a lack of planning, especially in the beginning stages of like writing out all my ideas. I also wish that I engaged more with other forms for inspiration, especially short film, because I think engaging with different forms would just kind of bring out different aspects and give you more ideas for your major work. I've said this so many times, but I think it really all comes down to justifying the choices you're making, why you've made it and the effect. I wish that I justified all choices from the very beginning, especially character, setting, form, structure, PV and genre, because that would have made it so much easier. Especially writing the reflection statement would have taken less time. It would have helped me with my major work as well, because I would have known what I was doing and I would have had to focus less on trying to think of good reason for something I did. Similar to that, if I planned everything properly, I would have had clearer motifs and symbolism. For example, I did have motifs and like symbolism via a bird that always came back at important moments, and I also had a lot of motifs about like noise and music, but I could have developed it more and made it less obvious. And honestly, I didn't have a good reason for having the bird there. It was supposed to symbolize freedom and it was an allusion to Maya Angelou's I Know What the Caged Bird Sings, but it didn't really have much punch or impact because it didn't need to be there, like it wasn't necessary. And for my reflection, I wish that I had made a reference list from the very beginning that was like fully referenced. And finally, this is like a big tip in terms of just like especially writing. I wish I drew from my own experiences more in terms of like emotions, because if you think about it, in everyday life we are always experiencing and witnessing snippets of someone's life story. So from this we can kind of capture these moments of humanness and humanity and insert them or be inspired to use that in our major work. So for example, let's say like you walk down the train station and you see like two kids whispering, right? You can think, okay, failed attempts at whispering by two children, that may serve as a moment that your character witnesses or as an action that your character actually does. So linked to this, recall how you felt, acted or processed certain emotions like anger, grief and disappointment. What small movements did you do? And use that and insert that into your major work. For example, when you're laughing, your eyes are going to crease together. If you have a lot of wrinkles or you're middle-aged or elderly, you're going to see someone's crow's feet, so you can write about that. If you're crying, obviously there's different ways of crying. There's like the quiet crying. What you can write is that, your character fiercely swipes away that lone tear that is kind of betraying their demeanor. If someone's disappointed, their eyes can be averted, the shoulders can be slumped in defeat. I think when trying to convey emotions, which will help with characterization, hone in on the really small details that you often can witness in everyday life. Okay, here I'll show you what I wrote for my assessment tasks. So here's the literature review. And here's the critique of the creative process. I would tell you my marks, but I can't find them. Okay, so I've basically thrown a lot of words at you, so if you're wondering what you can do right now, here are some tips that might help you generate ideas right after you watch this video. So think of topics or subjects that you like, are interested in, or are good at. So for me, that was music because I was okay at it, I liked it, and so I had a good background knowledge of it. So for my major work, I thought of musicians who I liked, Tchaikovsky, Mozart, and Alina Katz-Chernin, but I couldn't see myself writing a story about like any of them. So I just did more research, and at the end I arrived at Shostakovich, and like I said earlier before, I explained why I chose him as my main character. You can also think of historical figures who you find interesting and ask yourself, why do you find them interesting? Like, is it their stories, any like controversy around them, or their artwork, stuff like that. Think of common themes in the text that you've read, like for leisure or in school, in English Advanced and English Extension 1 in year 11 and year 12. So for example, from memory, I think 1984 deals a lot with like the human spirit, the human condition, emotions, living in an oppressive state, how a character deals with that. Also like the idea of history and memory and how it can be like manipulated and rewritten or erased. Also, you can engage with different media forms, so movies, music videos, films, poetry, even newspapers, or like if you're scrolling through like Instagram or Facebook, sometimes like random words might pop out at you, just jot them down. Okay, and another question to ask yourself is, what is something that everyone or most people have experienced or can relate to? Just jot, like brainstorm, do a mind map, and then you can kind of just write about those things, and hopefully you can get an idea for your major work. I just briefly want to talk about writer's blocks. So for this one, do a mind map of like themes, characters, do spontaneous writing, set your timer for 10 minutes and just write whatever comes to your mind. Get rid of the mindset that it has to be perfect or good. You can write anything. Like I remember when I did spontaneous writing back then, I literally wrote whatever came to my mind. I was like, swag, YOLO, and then I talk about like the human condition or whatever. Have a small notepad and pen that you take with you like everywhere, or you can put it next to your bed. Okay, and a final thing to conclude with is that sometimes writing is just straight up like not a vibe, especially when you know that you have to write for the sake of it, and also because it's being marked by the markers. So you kind of feel like you can't just write about whatever, like it kind of has to have a message and you have to use techniques and all of that. But I think the best way around this is that life is a struggle. Just force yourself to write. Just get something onto the paper. It's like if you write 500 words, at least 10 words are gonna be good material, you know what I mean? And there may be days where you feel demotivated, and that's okay. You can take rest days. But I suggest setting internal deadlines for yourself. So for example, by the end of February, I want to have written 500 words, or I want to have a character profile fleshed out by then. I also did this for assignments, which helped a lot. So I would try and finish assignments like 2 to 3 days before and edit it. Sometimes I didn't manage to, and I kind of did it last minute, but that is not the point. Basically, set internal deadlines for yourself and try and stick to them. And yeah, it's a long process because it's over 1 year, but time really does fly by quite quickly. So I suggest have like monthly or weekly milestones and do the best you can. So yeah, good luck, stay safe, and if you have any questions, ask in the comments, or if you have any thoughts, feel free to comment them as well. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in my next video. Bye.
It's like a Polaroid love, 사랑 촌스러운 그 감정